We've had much opportunity over the course of the years that we're learning to discuss an idea which is really very profoundly explained by the Alter Rebbe in many places in Torah particularly, but also in the Likutei Torah, that gives a very, very rich perspective on the history of the Jewish people. And it's a subject, it's an area of Jewish history that touches on how we understand Torah, how we understand Torah Sheba'al Peh, how we understand the basic reality of Jewish religious life. That means the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs. That's really very important to understand. The point is that the first 1,000 years of Jewish history were defined by nevuah, by prophecy. And as a practical matter, that means the center of Jewish life was spirituality, what you and I would call Kabbalah. After that 1,000 years, the center of Jewish life became halacha, became Torah Sheba'al Peh, became scholarship, intellect. And I want to repeat some of the conversations that we've had on this subject in the past as a means of setting up the Maamar we're about to learn. And I must be candid and say, as is, everybody understands that when a teacher teaches a Maamar and explains it in a particular way, this is his understanding of the Maamar. I hope, I trust that I'm explaining the Maamar correctly. But this is my understanding of what Alter Rebbe is trying to achieve here in this Maamar. So let's have this conversation again. When the Jewish people were born as a nation, the ideal Jew was a Navi, was a prophet. The Gemara says that during the era of prophecy, there were kiflayim ki yetzei Mitzrayim. There were twice as many prophets as there were people who left Egypt. That means 1.2 million prophets. 1,200,000 Nevi'im, men and women, over the course of 1,000 years. And I find it very compelling that it's 1,000 years to the year. It's exactly 1,000 years, because 2448 was Yetzias Mitzrayim, 2004 was Mitzrayim. 480 years later, they built the first Beis HaMikdash. 410 years after that, the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. That's 890. There were 70 years of Galus Bavel, is 960. And there's 40 years until the death of Shimon HaTzadik, when Kava Ner Ma'aravi, when the spirituality, when the godliness, when the Western light went out. And it's the 40 years after the binyan of the second Beis HaMikdash, which, as we know from Sfarim, is also Rishon LeMinyan Shtaris. It's the beginning of the reign of Alexander the Great, and that's the first of the Minyan Shtaris, which is a calendar which we don't keep, but the Rambam brings it, and so on. So it's mamish 1,000 years. During that period of 1,000 years, Yidden kept mitzvahs. There was halacha, there was mitzvahs, there was tefillin, there was mezuzah, there was alazach, there was karbonis. But the center of Jewish life was nevuah. In other words, the equivalent today of a yeshiva where people go and excel as Jews, then was a yeshiva where they teach nevuah. And there were these communities of people who would live in isolation, in solitude, by themselves, and they would undertake certain exercises. Obviously, a significant part of that was that they would excel in chokhmah, like the Rambam writes. One of the preconditions to nevuah is that a person should be a very big chokham, and then a gibir, that is mizgaber al yitzrei tomid, ve'ein yitzrei mizgaber alav afilu pa'amachas. He always went to Yetzer Hara, and other characteristics. And after all of the preparation, they would be taught exercises to achieve nevuah, and lepa'amim yishre, lepa'amim yishre, la yishre. Sometimes they would become prophets, sometimes they would not become prophets. So the religious goal of a Jew was to become a prophet. From the perspective of halacha, there was Torah Shebeksav and there was Torah Shebal Peh. But the nature of Torah Shebal Peh, which the Anshe Knesset Agdela established, that it's binding and that it's carried over from generation to generation, really began at the end of that period. And what happened was that the Jewish religious world shifted away from a condition where the most important thing was Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah, spirituality, intimacy with God, towards scholarship, towards Torah Shebal, towards learning, towards understanding, towards the Bezdin, towards the yeshivas, towards Yavne, and so forth. So the Chachamim, in other words. And of course, the Anshe Knesset Agdela had all these enactments that empowered the Chachamim. That when they made a psak din in one Bezdin, a later Bezdin was bound by the same Piskei Din, and so forth and so on. The reason for this shift was very, very important. When the Jewish nation was born, there was a lot of chokhmah, there was a lot of intellect. The Jewish people, the pasuk says, "Hi chokhmaschem v'vinaschem le'nei ha'amim." The pasuk says, "Am chochem v'novin." The Chazal tell us that Chedesh v'Amizgir, that when Nebuchadnezzar came to Eretz Yisrael and he took spoils, he took plunder from Yerushalayim. What was the greatest thing he took from Yerushalayim? It was the minds of the Jewish people, it was the chokhmah of the Chachamim, because they were extraordinary Chachamim, and everybody knew it at that time, that the Jews were intellectually superior. But that was all called chitzonius. And in the language of Chassidus, it was acheraim, it was the back. The pnimius, the ponim, the face that defined Jewish life was nevuah ruach HaKodesh, was spirituality, was intimacy with godliness through the exercises that people would engage in of his beidadus and so forth and so on, until the Shekhinah would rest upon them. Why was it changed? It was changed because it was understood, it was clear, it was evident that the Ruach HaKodesh was going to leave, the Nevuah was going to depart, and once the Ruach HaKodesh and the Nevuah departed, if they would hold on to that tradition, Rahman al-San, the Jewish nation would fall apart. And I'll tell you a personal thought that I have. I have indicators for this, I have shtiklach rayas for this, but I've never seen this very clearly in a sefer, that we fast Tzom Gedalia. We fast on the day Gedalia was murdered. And of course the question becomes, Gedalia was by no means the only Navi who was killed. Some of the greatest Nevi'im were killed, including Yeshaya himself. Why are we fasting on the day that Gedalia ben Achikam was murdered? And the answer is because when Gedalia ben Achikam was murdered, the Yishuv, the community of Jewish people, that Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel HaRasha allowed to remain in Eretz Yisrael and to continue Jewish habitation, was destroyed. The story was that there was a power struggle between Egypt and Bavel, Egypt and Babylon, and the Navi said, follow Nebuchadnezzar, even though he was such an evil Rasha and he had done so much damage to the Jews, and Egypt was trying to seduce the Jews, trying to pull the Jews in their direction, and they didn't listen, and the people who committed the act of murder, they were Gedaliah's friends, the coup d'etat, they basically made a coup, they overthrew him and they killed him, were leaning towards Egypt. So the remaining Jews in the Yeshiva Yisrael ran off to Egypt. All of this was calamitous. The community of Egypt was eventually wiped out at Alexandria and so on. But every Jew who had been living in Eretz Yisrael left. And the way I understand it is this. Had Gedaliah not been murdered, had the Jewish people continued living in Eretz Yisrael after the Beis HaMikdash Rishon was destroyed, the Ruach HaKodesh, the divine spirit, which was the basis for the era of prophecy, would have continued. There's Jews living in the Holy Land, the Nevuah rests. When the Jewish people left, the Ruach HaKodesh left. And when they came back, it didn't return. In other words, the murder, the death of Gedaliah is not the death of a person. It's a death of a very, very serious level of Jewish life. That during the era of the first Beis HaMikdash, and what would have continued in the period between the first and second Beis HaMikdash, it was a time of Nevuah, of Ruach HaKodesh. That means to say that the ultimate Jew was not the scholar, not the intellectual. The ultimate Jew was the spiritual Jew who was in tune to godliness, to Ein Sof, to Nevuah, to Ruach HaKodesh on whatever levels. And the murder of Gedaliah and the departure of the last Jew from Eretz Yisrael was the basis for the departure of the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah would never return when the second Beis HaMikdash was built. But it's complicated. Why is it complicated? It's complicated because when the second Beis HaMikdash was built, there still were many Nevi'im around, including Shimon HaTzadik himself, and the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And this is the story, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, who of course were also the Seifrim, they're the same people. They sealed the Tanakh. They anticipated, they understood, they perceived, they saw into the future that it was only a matter of time before the era of Nevuah as such, that there were so many Nevi'im would end. And the changes that they made, first of all, to seal the Tanakh, to close it off, there's no more Nevuah. There's no more Mikra. And then, of course, to introduce formal Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is binding, and all the various halachas that they made about the koyach of one Sanhedrin versus another Sanhedrin, and so forth and so on, were all in anticipation of that eventual disappearance of Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh. So the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, amongst whom there were many Nevi'im, were shifting the Jewish people away from Nevuah towards Chochmah because they anticipated that the spirituality, that the Nevuah, the holiness, the light, the transcendence, the godliness would go away. And if the Jewish people were going to survive, they would have to shift the center, the priority of Jewish life away from Nevuah towards Chochmah. And of course, what's the end of the story? The Anshe Knesset HaGedolah did this. And so long as the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah lived, nobody questioned them. In other words, their authority, their power was so strong that even though they changed the face of Yiddishkeit so radically, this is the most important change in the entire history of the Jewish people. There's been no change like it before or since. Because for the first 1,000 years, they had Torah Sheba'al Peh, they had Chochmah, they had Halacha, but it was all Chitzonius, it was all Acherayim. The key was the Nevuah, the Ruach HaKodesh. And all of a sudden, a group of people come along and they say the most important thing is Chochmah. It's Torah Sheba'al Peh, Nevuah, Ruach HaKodesh, Me'echet. And they had many Nevi'im amongst them themselves, and nevertheless they made these shifts. As long as they lived, nobody questioned it. But Shimon HaTzadik was Mishiyari Knesset HaGedolah, like it says in Pirkei Avos, he was from the last of them. And he passes away, and he's succeeded by his disciple, by his Mamala Mokem, Antignis Ish Seichei. So it says in Avos that Rav Nosson, that Antignis Seichei said something which could have been understood to mean that there's no schar, that there's no Elam Haba, and Tzaddik and Baitus made their revolution. The Tzdukim, the Baitusim broke away, and they created a whole new movement within Judaism, which is a revolution against the Koyach of the Chachamim. In other words, Tzaddik Ubaitis were really not rebelling against Antignis Ish Seichei. Tzaddik Ubaitis were really rebelling against the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. But as long as the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah were alive, no one questioned them. After the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah passed away, along came some people and said, wait a minute. For 1,000 years, the most important thing in Jewish life was prophecy and spirituality and enlightenment and godliness. Why are we becoming academics? Why are we becoming intellectuals? Why are we becoming scholars? Why are we making acherayim of Torah the Iker, and Pnimius Torah is being neglected? Now, of course, the reason Tzaddik Ubaitis were wrong was because the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah did what they did, if you will, Eis Las Es Lashem Efeira Terasecha. They understood that the Ruach HaKodesh was going to go away. And you can't force Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh either comes or it doesn't come. It's not up to you. It's not even up to how prepared you are. It's up to the Eibishter. And Tzaddik Ubaitis insisted on holding on to the traditions that they had from the terms of the first Beis HaMikdash, which basically were every Rav paskins as he wishes. And because the Ruach HaKodesh had gone, and the Nevuah had gone, so they were really arguing Chochmah against Chochmah. In other words, in the end, like it says in so many Sfarim, the Kroyim and the Baitusim and the Tzdukim were all against the idea of the Chachamim giving interpretation. So what did they do? They gave interpretations of their own. There's no such thing as mitzvahs without interpretation. It wasn't like they didn't give their interpretations. They were just different than the Chachamim. And of course, one of the key components of this, the idea that when a Rav in one Sanhedrin paskins a halacha, the next Sanhedrin and the next Sanhedrin, the next Sanhedrin, till Mashiach comes, is bound by that halacha, unless they're Godel, B'chacham, or B'minyan. This is what they opposed. In other words, what Tzaddik Ubaitis were really interested in was holding on to what had been until the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah changed it. But as long as the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah were alive, no one would question their authority. Once they were gone, the revolution happened. And of course, this is the story of the second Beis HaMikdash, this struggle between the Prushim, who were the new people on the block. The Prushim were modern. The Prushim were people who had created or were following a Yiddishkeit created by the Anshe Kesses HaGedela, who said that the most important thing is the Sanhedrin, the Chachamim, not even the Beis HaMikdash, not even the Kohen Gadol, the Rabbonim. And the Tzdukim and the Perush and the Baitusim were insisting on spirituality, on Nevuah, Ruach HaKodesh, what had been in the Zman Bayis Rishon. And we all know what happened to them. In the end, they ended up in Christianity. And this is a very, very basic insight into Jewish history. Now, I'm telling it to you as a story, but if you read the Maamar in Torah, where the Alter Rebbe talks about Bayis Rishon versus Bayis Sheni, you see clearly, explicitly, that I'm not making this up. I'm presenting to you an idea that the Alter Rebbe teaches in many places, or in a number of places in Torah, Likutei Torah, and that is that Jewish life has two periods. The first 1,000 years, that number is mine, but it seems, I gave you the facts. Shimon HaTzadik passes away exactly 1,000 years after Yetzias Mitzrayim. This is, in other words, this is 2448, this is 3448. 40 years after the Beis HaMikdash Sheni was built. The second Beis HaMikdash was built in 3408, 3408, and it was destroyed in 3828. It stood for 420 years. And 40 years into that period, Shimon HaTzadik passes away, and this is when all the trouble starts. This is when everything changes. And the rest of history, in other words, the last 2,500 years approximately, is a second era. And what's the difference? The difference is, to use classic Hasidic language, the first 1,000 years is a period of Punim. And the subsequent years, including most of Zman Bayis Sheni, is a period of Ocher. The Pnimius of Yiddishkeit is Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah, Lakus. And the Acherayim, the back of Yiddishkeit, is Chochmah. And this, again, is a concept that we've had so many opportunities to discuss, that the Pnimius of the Torah which we learn is Ein Sof. But we're only able to understand it. And the Ein Sof, which is behind the Chochmah, is hidden from us. And as a result, we have to work so hard to use our Chochmah, and I don't mean me and you, I mean the Tanoim and the Amiroyim, to be Mechaven Lamitosa Shel Torah, like it says in Samach Vav, in such great length. The incredible greatness of the Tanoim, who were, in quotes, groping in the dark because they didn't have the Nevuah, they didn't have Ruach HaKodesh, and they say that they achieved a level of emes which is even greater than that of the Nevi'im. But it was all in the darkness, it was all Chochmah. And in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, it was a time of incredible Ruach HaKodesh and enlightenment. Even in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, when they paskin the halach, it wasn't based on Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh. Teirelei b'shamayim. It was based on Chochmah. But when you're an inspired person, when you're a person who has Ruach HaKodesh, the Chochmah that comes from the Ruach HaKodesh is much simpler than when you don't have that Ruach HaKodesh. So you have these two periods in Jewish life. You have 1,000 years when the definition of the Jewish people was godliness, was spirituality. To use a different word, was to be a merkava for Ein Sof. And Chochmah Satera, Seichel Atera was a secondary thing. It was a residual thing. It was an effect of the state of Ruach HaKodesh. And in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash and onward, the most important thing became the union of Chochmah, of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of understanding, of learning and interpreting and understanding, and so forth and so on. And just to give you a bit of a context, to add to this story, the onset of Kabbalah, and then later on the emergence of the Arizal, and then later on the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe and the Chabad Rabbeim and so forth and so on, is really going full circle. This is bringing back the union of Pnimius HaTorah, of spirituality, of Ruach HaKodesh, of Nevuah, that although people like you and me are not Shayches to Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah, we indulge, we partake of Pnimius HaTorah, and allow the richness of Pnimius HaTorah to add a richness to our lives. And it's, so to speak, going full circle. You're going away from the most important thing being the Chochmah to the most important thing being the Oyer, the Simcha, the Emunah, and so forth. And of course, you understand the controversy and why the Misnagdim would come out against it. The Misnagdim are preserving what was the tradition. And the tradition is that since the times that are Anshik Sagedela, the most important people in the Jewish world are the Sanhedrin, are the Chachamim, and the most important thing in Jewish life is Torah Sheba'al Peh, is interpreting and understanding Chochmas HaTorah. The idea of Mikra, which is Shmei Tzef Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Ein Sof, and all those other things that we are so familiar with, became secondary. But in Pnimius HaTorah, in the onset of Chassidus and Kabbalah, which as we know is Te'ameh Chayim Zachu, it's a foretaste of what's going to be when Mashiach comes, when we're again going to have the Eira Pnimius HaTorah, is going back, is bringing back a little bit that type of Yiddishkeit where Chas v'shalom to say that halach is unimportant. Faket, chassid seif and chassid is in from the Pnimius Shur, but at the same time, the union of a chassid is they should have a sagin alakut, should have a relationship with godliness, with this, which is the same neshama of Torah that in the time of Bayis Rishon existed in a very, very spiritual way. Why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you all this because we're about to learn a Maamar. It's actually not a very long Maamar. The point of this Maamar is to discuss the first Parsha of Krishma versus the second Parsha of Krishma. Shema and V'ahavta versus V'hayim Shamayim. You'll see soon the way the Maamar says what it says. But it seems to me that what the Alter Rebbe is really saying is what I just described. That the difference between the first Parsha Krishma and the second Parsha Krishma is the first Parsha Krishma is describing a form of Yiddishkeit where the most important thing is spirituality, is Ruach HaKodesh, is Eir, is godliness. And the second Parsha Krishma is describing a Yiddishkeit where the most important thing is Chochmas HaTorah and the preciseness of doing mitzvahs, the exactness, the preciseness of doing a mitzvah. And this Maamar is in effect saying that when you're doing the first Parsha Krishma, you're dealing with a Yid or with a Yiddishkeit that's all about Ruchnius and Elokus. And when you're dealing with the second Parsha Krishma, you're dealing with a Yid or with a Yiddishkeit which is all about practicality and doing mitzvahs and doing it precisely and bringing it down into this world and so forth and so on. And I want to tell you a Dvar Torah. And when I say I want to tell you a Dvar Torah, I want to tell you something which I don't remember if I ever saw. It's a thought. I may have seen it, but I don't remember where and when. But it's a very, very interesting insight into the difference between the first Parsha Krishma and the second Parsha Krishma. In the first Parsha Krishma, near the end, you have three things. You have Torah, you have Tefillin, and you have Mezuzah, right? V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bom, v'shivtecha b'visacha v'lechatecha v'derecha v'shachach v'mecha, that's Torah. Ukshartam lo'isa idacha v'hoyu l'tetafis benenecha, that's Tefillin. Uksaftam al mezuzah b'visacha v'visharecha, that's Mezuzah. Right? The second Parsha Krishma, you have the same three things, but a different order. Ukshartam lo'isa idacha v'hoyu l'tetafis benenecha, that's Tefillin. V'limadetem oisam es benechem l'daber bom, you teach them to your children, v'shivtecha v'visacha v'lechatecha v'derecha v'shachach v'mecha, that's Torah. Uksaftam al mezuzah b'visacha v'visharecha. So why is it that the first Parsha Krishma, first you have Torah, then you have Tefillin, then you have Mezuzah? And of course there's a lot of nafkaminas la'alacha about Hekesh, Hukshakal Tera Kul Tefillin, Hukshakal Tera Kul Mezuzah, which is a Gemara in Kedushin. And in the second Parsha you have first Tefillin, and then you have Krishma, and then you have Mezuzah. And the Vart is Azay. In the first Parsha Krishma, the first thing you have is Torah. What is Torah? Torah in this case is Torah Oyer. Torah means the idea that through the Torah you reveal godliness. In other words, not the Torah that teaches you how to do the mitzvahs practically, but rather the Torah that enlightens you with Ein Sof, with godly light. And you learn about the Torah, and the godly light that you have in the Torah inspires the way you're going to put on tefillin, and it inspires the way you're going to put up a mezuzah. That when you put on tefillin, and of course, huksha kala Torah kul tefillin, all the tayag mitzvahs are compared to tefillin, and we all know that all the tayag mitzvahs are compared to, and al derech, pardon me, al derech, all the mitzvahs are compared to mezuzah. Huksha kala Torah tefillin, kala Torah kul mezuzah. The Gemara says that also. It's all in the spirit of Torah. Torah is oir, it's godliness. And the oir Torah, the godliness of Torah, when you puts on tefillin, he experiences Elokus. A person puts up a mezuzah, he experiences Elokus. But that's only the first Parsha Krishma. In the second Parsha Krishma, you start with tefillin. What does tefillin mean? Do a mitzvah. Do a mitzvah practically. And after he tells you to do a mitzvah, he tells you to learn Torah. Because the Torah in the second Parsha Krishma is not the same Torah as in the first Parsha Krishma. The Torah in the first Parsha Krishma is Torah, it's godliness. It enlightens, it inspires, it's Ruach HaKodesh, it's Ein Sof, it's Nevuah, and so on. The Torah in the second Parsha Krishma means Pashat Shulchan Aruch, to learn Torah, to know how to do mitzvahs. So first you have tefillin, and tefillin represents the mitzvahs. And then you have to teach the tefillin. You have to teach the mitzvahs how to do them practically, and that's the second parsha. And then comes mezuzah. So the difference in the order, that in the Parsha Rishayna first you have Torah, and this Parsha Schneur you first have tefillin, is because in the first Parsha the Torah is a very different Torah. It's the godly Torah. It's a Torah of Ein Sof. In other words, it's the Torah like it was the condition of Jewish life in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, when it was all about Ein Sof, it was all about Ruchnius, it was all about Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh. Of course they did mitzvahs, and of course they did mitzvahs precisely, and of course they did mitzvahs based on the interpretation of Chachamim and not Nevi'im, because the Navi is not allowed to be Mechadeh, Ein Navi Rashel Chadeh Dava Meyata Chas V'Sholem. And if a Navi is a Chacham, it's two separate things. The Nevuah is one thing and the Chacham is a separate thing. And when they interpreted the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Torah Shebeksav, in order to know how to do Halacha L'maaseh mitzvahs, they did it with their Chachma. But that's not what the essence of Jewish life was. The essence of Jewish life was Torah, was Ruach HaKodesh, Ruchnius, Nevuah. And the second Parsha Krishma is describing a world where the Ruach HaKodesh is gone, the Ein Sof is lifted, the Pnimius is gone. What's left is Acherayim. What's left is Chitzonius. What's left is the Torah and our ability to interpret it. And Chacham and Chachamim and Chochma of Torah and being Mechaven Lamitasa Shel Torah becomes the most important thing. And therefore, the mitzvah tefillin tells you how you're supposed to learn Torah. So this is the spirit in which we're going to learn this Maamar. Again, I'm teaching you the Maamar the way I understand it, and I believe that I'm giving you, I trust, I hope, that I'm giving you a correct understanding of the Maamar, and the spirit of what I'm presenting to you is that Parsha Rishayna represents a Torah of Oir, of godliness, and Parsha Shniya represents a Torah of Maaseh HaMitzvahs and the halachas that lead to the kiyum of the Maaseh HaMitzvahs. Now, one of the things you're going to see in the Maamar that are going to present the idea that I just proposed is the terminology Achalifu D'chtayu. Achalifu D'chtayu means the concept of changing places. There's a concept in Kabbalah that says that there's kelim and oiris, there's vessels and there's light. And there's 10 vessels. There's the Kli of Chesed, there's the Kli of Gavura, there's the Kli of Teferes, and so on. And there's 10 lights, 10 oiris. There's the Oira Chesed, there's Oira Gavura, and Oira Teferes, and so on. And Achlifu D'chtayu means when you have Oira Chesed beKli Gavura, when you have the light of Chesed in the vessel of Gavura, or you have Oira Gavura beKli Chesed, the light of Gavura in the vessel of Chesed. And our Maamar's proposal, our Maamar's presentation, our Maamar's understanding of the first Parsha of Krishma versus the second Parsha of Krishma is going to revolve around that construct. At the first Parsha of Krishma is Oir HaChesed beKli HaGavura. The vessel of the Parsha Rishayna is Gavura. Pardon me, I said it wrong. Oir HaGavura beKli HaChesed. The vessel of Parsha Rishayna is Chesed, and the light of Parsha Rishayna is Gavura. And the second Parsha Krishma is Fakert. It's Oir HaChesed beKli HaGavura. The second Parsha Krishma is Gavura, and the Oir of Parsha Shniya is Chesed. So again, let's say it again. The theme, the principle of this Maamar is going to be the two ideas that I presented, a very, very spiritual, light-based Judaism versus a very practical, halachic, mitzvah and chachma-oriented Judaism. And the language of the Maamar is going to be achalifu d'chtayu, that you're putting the wrong light into the wrong vessel. In Parsha Rishona, the kli is chesed and the oir is gevura, and in Parsha Shnia, the kli is gevura and the oir is chesed. This is how the Alter Rebbe is going to present it. So I am going to give you another introduction about achalifu d'chtayu. And the reason I'm giving this introduction is because I want to. That's the truth of the matter. Because the concept of achalifu d'chtayu, how it's understood in this Maamar, is basic, is general. You learn the later Maamarim achalifu d'chtayu in a much edler way. So I'm going to try and present to you the theory of achalifu d'chtayu, as I understand it. It's not going to take very long. And afterwards, we're going to understand how achalifu d'chtayu is understood in this Maamar. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit more basic, a little bit more simple. So first, we're going to have a theoretical conversation about achalifu d'chtayu. Then we're going to apply achalifu d'chtayu to our Maamar, and then we're going to learn the part of the Maamar which is designated for us to learn tonight, this week. There's two concepts in Chassidus. And by the way, the material that I'm sharing with you is based on a Maamar in Mem Gimel. Tafish Mem Gimel, it's a Pesach Maamar, I believe. And of course, the very beginning of Hemshech Hayim Beis. The Maamar of Nosei and Ba'aleischa, I think it is, or Shvuas and Nosei, where the Rebbe Rashab introduces the big chiddush of the Hemshech Hayim Beis, which is the concept of Eidos Mitzayorim, and there he brings the sugya of achalifu d'chtayu, and he answers the tzarachiyun that he asked some 30 years before in Tafish Mem Gimel. There's two concepts in Kabbalah. One concept in Kabbalah is called hiskalalus, and the other concept in Kabbalah is called the achalifu d'chtayu. What's the difference between the Kabbalistic concept of hiskalalus and the Kabbalistic concept of achalifu d'chtayu? The difference is that the Kabbalistic concept of hiskalalus has to do primarily with kelim, with vessels. Over the years, we've talked about hiskalalus a lot, and I've presented to you the classic ideas. You have Keirach, Tafresh Ayin Aleph, Keirach and Aderes, Tafresh Ayin Beis, Hemshech, in the Maamar of Tafresh Ayin Dalet, and other places. We have 3 or 4 different types of hiskalalus. And the ultimate hiskalalus, the highest hiskalalus, the deepest hiskalalus, which is called Mebli Hashayimotze Reish V'Seif, has to do with kelim. Hiskalalus is a phenomenon to do with kelim. I'll explain it soon. As opposed to achalifu d'chtayu, which is a concept that has to do with Ein Sof, with oir. And like I said, I'll explain this all momentarily. So let's start off with the concept of hiskalalus. The meaning of hiskalalus is interconnectedness, integration, unification of different parts. In order for there to be hiskalalus, there has to first be hischalkus. Right? A human body can be integrated because it's made up of diverse parts. If the human body was one point, like for example, when it's one seed, when it's one nekuda, one point, there can be no integration if there's no division. Integration is based on division. That when you have a system which is complex, that's made up of many, many different components, and each one serves a very different purpose, and each one is healthy unto itself, and self-contained, and distinct, and separate from every other component. And these distinct components, where each one is emphatically, is dafka, separate from the next, integrate and join together in such a way that each one needs the other, and each one gives to the other, and each one takes from the other. And again, the lashon which is brought, to such an extent that the head is only a head in one aspect, and the foot is like the head in another aspect. And in that aspect, where the foot is like the head is like the foot, that's hiskalalus. You have a bunch of vessels, you have a bunch of limbs, a bunch of organs. You have the brain, you have the eyes, you have the ears, you have the nose, you have the mouth, you have the heart, you have the lung. You have the stomach, the kidneys, the liver, the spleen, the intestines, and so on. And then, of course, you have the arms and the legs, the hair, the skin, and the nails. And each one of these components are so different. Some are so vital. Some are dvarim shanefesh tluya behem, life and death depend on them, and others seem to be so secondary. Yet in a healthy body, the balance and the interrelatedness between the parts is perfect and precise. If you have 2 heads, you're a treifa. If you have 2 hearts, you're a treifa. If you're missing skin, or you're missing nails, there's a chesed. And every part of the body complements every other part. And of course, the way it's explained ultimately in Chassidus is because each point, each nekuda, has all the nekudas within itself. Each aver, each limb, each organ in the body has a lot of hispartos, a lot of detail. And hidden within the detail of each organ is all the other organs. And since in each of the organs, let's say in the head, you also have the heart which is in the head, and the liver which is in the head, and the arms which are in the head, and the feet which are in the head, and so forth and so on. And the same, of course, works the other way around. So because each organ is so complex and so behispartus, so divided up into little teeny components, and each one has within itself, in a small way, each of the other organs, so the integration between the various organs is incredibly, incredibly sophisticated. This is the Taichas Skalalus, that the many become one. But the precondition, the prerequisite for the many to become one is where each individual aspect is healthy unto itself. There's no taru, it's not all mixed up, it's not a cholent, it's not a confusion. Each one is distinct and each one is healthy. And after the health in each aspect of the guf, because each aspect of the guf is behisrachvos and behispartos, and it has all the other evarim within itself, so for example, the gevura within chesed allows it to be behisachtos with the chesed which is in gevura, and so forth. And this is called hiskalalus. And hiskalalus is what we call organic, healthy. Many, many things becoming one living being, because it's integrated in such a way that it's impossible to say which is primary and which is secondary. Every aspect needs everything else. This concept of hiskalus is a deep concept. It's really a tikkun concept, right? In Toihu, the predominance is oir, and in tikkun, the predominance is kelim. We just spoke about this at length. For example, in the Maamar of Vayishlach, and in other places as well. And this health, which has to do with kelim, is the reason tikkun is sustained. Eires muatim bekelim merubim, and tayu is not sustainable. Eires merubim bekelim muat. This is hiskalalus. The concept of hiskalalus is well known and it's ancient, and it goes to the core of Kabbalah, because hiskalalus is all about atzilus. Atzilus has many vessels, and the vessels are emphatically distinct. They're separate. Chesed is separate and Gevurah is separate, and yet there's an incredible unity to such an extent that Atzilus is called Olam Ha'achtos. But the unity in Atzilus is not a unity where everything is behizbatlus. Chesed loses its identity, and Gevurah loses its identity. That's an act. That's an akudim. Kulam akudim b'kli yechad. In Atzilus, Chesed is Chesed, and it's distinctly Chesed. Gevurah is Gevurah, and it's distinctly Gevurah. But they fuse together because of their bittul to the kavanah. And because of their hisrachavos, where in Chesed you already have Gevurah, and in Gevurah you already have Chesed, and so forth and so on, that the diverse and complex system becomes a one. But not a one that eliminates the diversity, but a one that integrates, that unifies the diversity to such an extent that it's really, really the deepest kind of oneness imaginable. And that's Elam Atikun, that's Elam Achtas, that's Atzilus, and it's a Keli for Ein Sof, and so forth and so on. That's a traditional, it's a classic idea in Chassidus and Kabbalah called hiskalalus, which is another concept, a chlifa d'chtayu. A chlifa d'chtayu is not about the kelim, it's about the yoyer. That there's a kliya chesed, and there's a kliya gevurah, and there's a oyra chesed, and there's a oyra gevurah, and the oyra chesed goes into the kliya gevurah, that's a chlifa d'chtayu. The oyra gevurah goes into the kliya chesed, it's a chlifa d'chtayu. So in Tafresh Mem Gimel, like I said, I think it's a Maamar of Pesach, the Rebbe Rashab asks a question. According to some Shittas in Kabbalah, and the way I understand it from the Rebbe Sichis, from Parshas Vaeschanan, Tavshin Tezvov, that this is the Shittas HaPardes, the Ramak, that Eir is Pshutim, Eir in Sof is one. And the entire idea of Eir HaChesed versus Eir HaGevurah doesn't exist in Eir, it exists only in Kelim. Eir in Sof is one light, Ein Seif. What the Pardes calls Atzmus for Kelim. The light is one. The light goes into the vessel of Chesed, takes in the form of Chesed. The light goes into the vessel of Gevurah, takes in the form of Gevurah. So the question becomes, how could the Bechlal be a Chalifa d'chtayu? How could you speak about Eira Chesed going to Kliya Gevurah? Eira Chesed is not Chesed until it went into Kliya Chesed. Eira Gevurah, how can you speak about Eira Gevurah going into Kliya Chesed? Eira Gevurah isn't Gevurah until it went into Kliya Gevurah. And the Rebbe Rashab Taka finishes with a Tzarachiyim in Tafresh Mem Gimel. Until you get to the Ayin Beis, Hemshech Ayin Beis. And again, I'm simplifying and I'm generalizing and I'm certainly not giving you the whole picture. In the Hemshech Hayim Beis, the Rebbe Rashab finally reveals the true concept of Eidos Mitzayorim. The true concept of Esas Feidos and Eir. That until the Hemshech Hayim Beis is very equivocal, it's very vague, it's not clear at all. And as there's a sefer called Yisrael Neich HaGadol, from Yisrael Neich Blenitsky, it's a biography of him, where they quote him as having told a story that when he was in Lubavitch, he went over to the previous Rebbe, some Friedrich Rebbe, during the lifetime of his father, the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Nishmas HaYidin, and he asked him a contradiction from a Maimer on a Maimer. That in one Maimer it says one thing, and another Maimer it says something different. And one of the Maimorim was from the Hemshech Hayim Beis. So the Friedrich Rebbe told him, you can't ask a question from this Maimer and this Maimer. The Hemshech Hayim Beis is in ganz Nanaya linear. It's a whole new line. It's a different Chassidus. The Rebbe Rashab finally fully reveals the concept of Tikkun Shebetikkun, of the idea of Esas Feidos and Eir. And that Esas Feidos and Eir are not a product of the Reshimu and of Kalim and of Tzimtzum, but of Ratz, the very Seif Shalaf Niyad Tzimtzum. So the Rebbe Rashab says, whatever the concept of Esas Feidos and Eir is, it's a very sensitive concept, because the Rebbe Rashab in that famous Maimer of Nosei goes into Esas Feidos Belima, that they're 10 Sfeidos, but they're Belima, they have no Mitzias. The Rebbe Rashab says, only when you reach the Inyan of Eidos Mitzayorim, as it's explained in Ayin Beis, can you fully understand this concept in Kabbalah of a Chalifa D'Chtayu. Because until you have Eidos Mitzayorim, and to be sure, Eidos Mitzayorim you already have an Alter Rebbe in Tereir, in the Vilu Vashmalchus. But the concept of Eidos Mitzayorim, as explained in Hemshech Hayim Beis, where the Tzir and Eid is not because of Tzimtzum, and it's not because of Rishim, in other words, it's not because of Kalim, but it's because of Ratzon. In other words, Eid by itself has Sfiris. Then you can explain the concept of a Chalifa D'Chtayu. So it's almost like as if in the Hemshech Hayim Beis, the Rebbe Rashab is answering a Tzarachian, which he asked 29 years before. So the concept of a Chalifa D'Chtayu means that you have Oir. The Oir has not yet gone into a vessel, and yet the Oir has Oir HaChesed. You have another Oir that has not yet gone into a Keli, and nevertheless it's Oir HaGavura, and you can have the Eir HaGavura of a Kli HaChesed. Then of course in the Maimer and Tafresh Hayim Beis, the Rebbe Rashab says, how can you put Eir HaChesed into Kli HaGavura? How could you put Eir HaGavura into Kli HaChesed? And in short, the answer is because it's Esas Feidos Belima. The Chesed of Eir is so Belima, so without a Metzias, that it could be Mislabish in Kli HaGavura. That the Gavura of Eir is so Belima, without a Metzias, it can be Mislabish in Kli HaChesed, and so forth and so on. So this is a concept which is explained in Mamori Chassidus and so on. Here's the Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, where he uses the same idea of a Chalifa D'Chtayu. He doesn't at all go into anything I said. In other words, the way this Maimer develops, the concept of a Chalifa D'Chtayu is as if you were to say a Pnimius and a Chitzonius. You have the first Parsha of Krishma. The first Parsha of Krishma's essence is Chesed, that's its Pnimius. And this essence of the first Parsha of Krishma, which is Chesed, expresses itself in Gevurah. You have the second Parsha of Krishma, its essence, its Pnimius is Gevurah. And it expresses itself in a Tzir of Chesed. So the idea of a Chalifa D'Chtayu, as it's explained in this Maimer, is obviously similar to the concept of a Chalifa D'Chtayu as it's explained in Hemshech Hayim Beis, but it seems to me at least it's much more basic. In other words, not going into the subtleties of the question of how can you have Sfiris and Oir without Kalim, and what happens when the Sfiris that have a Tzir go into Kalim, and so forth and so on. But this is how our Maimer is going to go. Our Maimer is going to say the first Parsha of Krishma in essence is Chesed, and it's expressing itself in Gevurah. The second Parsha of Krishma in essence is Gevurah, and it's expressing itself in Chesed. And he's calling this a Chalifa D'Chtayu. So now, 44 minutes and 13 seconds into the class, let's read. But bear in mind what our intention is. We are going to be learning a Maimer. And I'm not yet sure how many parts the Maimer is going to have. But the end of the limud of this Maimer is going to be to explain to us the difference between Shema and V'Yahavta, which is the first Parsha of Krishma, and V'Hayam Shammai, which is the second Parsha of Krishma. And in short, The first Parsha of Krishma is going to represent what happens when you're inspired with godliness, when you're filled with Eidolaki. And the answer, of course, is that when you're filled with Eidolaki, you have Gavura. You want to become Batal HaKadosh Baruch. And the second Parsha of Krishma is going to be the opposite situation, where there is no Eidolaki. And you're dealing with a Yiddishkeit that comes down to tzimtzum and helam, concealment. You don't see the godly light. And it becomes very, very important to reveal as much of the halacha, of the practical side of Torah as possible. And that's going to be Oir HaChesed B'Kli HaGavura, as you'll see in Mitzvah Hashem in subsequent classes. So let's go. V'ahavta esavaya lekecha v'geimer. Our Maamar doesn't begin with the pasuk Shema Yisrael. It begins with v'ahavta. That's a mitzvah I say to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And of course, as it says in the Mishnah, based on the pasuk, there's different levels of ahav. It says that Rabbi v'ahavta out of Visharecha men beis tevim. It's brought in Sfarim that for the word v'ahavta until the word Visharecha is 42 words. U'parsha Schneur Sham. And the second parsha, which is from V'hoyim Shemeya, until Al Ha'aretz is Ayin Beis, or Shem Ayin Beis, it's 72 words. Or it's the Eibishter's name, Ab. And the question is, what is the meaning? What is the significance of the first parsha Krishma having 42 words, and the second parsha Krishma being connected to Shem Ab? It says the Rebbe V'hinei, that we know according to Kabbalah, Ki Shem Ab hu b'gevura, V'Shem Ab hu b'chesed. That the Eibishter's name Mem Beis of 42 words represent Midas HaGavura, and the Eibishter's name Ayin Beis, which is 72 or 72 words as it were, is connected to Midas HaChesed. In fact, 72 is the Gematria of Chesed. Chesed, Samach, and Dal is actually 72. Now, what's the relationship between 42 and Gavura? The relationship between 42 and Gavura, of course, is Ona B'Cheach. Right? Ona B'Cheach, Yidul Simin Chatat Tzerura. You have 7 lines, and each line has 6 words. 7 times 6 is 42. And of course, if you look in the Lubavitcher Sadurim, you have Ona B'Cheach written out in 6 columns. And on the left side, you have the Rosh Tevison, the abbreviations. Each abbreviation is 6 letters. And it says in Minhagim, it says in the Hem Yem, that when you say Ona B'Cheach, you're supposed to look at the abbreviated version of the 6 words, and you're supposed to think, as you're saying the 6 words, the kavan of those 6 letters. Now, I don't know exactly what the history of Ona B'Cheach is, but it's called in some Sfarim Tfilas Reb Nechunya ben Akana. But it seems that first there were the 42 letters, and then came Ona B'Cheach. In other words, there was a name of the Eibishter, which was 7 lines, and each of the 7 lines has 6 letters, beginning with Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Yud, Tov, Tzadik, Abag, Yitatz, and then of course the second line, and the third line, and the fourth line, and the fifth line, until the last line, Shavasenu Kabel, which Matzakasenu Diet Halumis, which is also 6 letters. And this Shem Mem Beis, this name of 42 letters, which is mentioned in the Gemara, and it's also mentioned in the Nevuchim and Rambam, is 42 letters. And from those 42 letters, they developed the Tefillah of Ona B'Cheach. And it says always in Sfarim that Ona B'Cheach is like Gvura, it's like Kaddish. Why? Because it has 42 words. What does 42 have to do with Gvura? It's very simple. There are 7 midas, 7 spheres, 7 midas, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Ched, Yesod, and Malchus. Of all of the 7, the one that represents Hamshach, the one that represents revealing and bringing down to the lower world is Malchus. If you include Malchus, it's 7 times 7, like by Sfiras HaEmer, for example, and 7 times 7 is 49. But if you have 7 times 6, not 7 times 7, it's 42. What's the cheshbon of 42? You cut off the Malchus. So it's Chesed Sheba Chesed, and Gvura Sheba Chesed, and Teferet Sheba Chesed, until Malchus Sheba Chesed, but there's no Malchus. When you have 6 times 7, rather than 7 times 7, you are dealing with a scenario, you're dealing with a context where you're missing the legs, you're missing the shleimus, you're missing the shulamis, the shleime, the idea of bringing down to the next world. So 6 spheres, 6 midas, going till Yesod. and not including the seventh sphere, the seventh midah, which is Malchus, represents not revealing in the lower worlds. The opposite of revealing in the lower worlds is not revealing in the lower worlds, and that's the name from Gevura. So 42 is the shame of Gevura because it represents the godliness as it's lacking that aspect of revealing in the lower world. So Mab is the name of Gevura. And Ab is the name of Chesed, 72. First of all, the Ab actually is Rosh Hashanah, is Begimate, Chesed. And of course, Ab is the deepest of the names Havaya. There's Ma, and there's Ban, and there's Sag, and there's Ab. Ab is the highest of the Eibishter's names, and reveals the highest Madrega of Elokus. So the Rebbe says, the first Parsha of Krishma has 42 words. The second Parsha of Krishma is connected to 72, to Ab. And the question is, V'alekan napechu, it's exactly the opposite. It doesn't make sense that the first Parsha of Krishma is connected to Mab, and it doesn't make sense that the second Parsha of Krishma is connected to Ab. Why not? The first Parsha of Krishma revolves around the theme of Chesed, like it says in the Pasuk V'Yahavta. The essence of the first Parsha of Krishma is love. And again, I'm going to share with you the idea that I've created, and I've set up as the foundation of the Maamar, revealing godliness. And revealing godliness is the ultimate chesed. So if revealing godliness is the idea of the first Parsha of Krishma, which is the ultimate chesed, why is it connected to Shem Mab, which is the name from Gevuras? On the other hand, the Parshas Shniya, the center, Parshas Shniya, says, Shamru lachem v'chulu. You should be careful not to make any mistakes, and not do any Avedas, and it's interesting. V'hayim shameya tishma'u. The first few psukim don't have any of that, right? They speak about great schar and all kinds of blessings. And the Alter Rebbe doesn't focus on the beginning. He focuses on the middle of the parsha, which speaks about you're going to do Avodah Zarah, you're going to serve Hashem in a way that you're supposed to, and there's going to be you're going to be sent out of Eretz Yisrael, and you're going to lose the Gilui Elokus. And after you're sent out of Eretz Yisrael and you leave the Gilui Elokus, all you have left in Golus is mitzvahs. And that's what Kshatam La'isa Eidecha V'hoyu Tavs B'Dinecha. And like I told you in my introduction, that you have to remember that even if you live in a time where you're sent out of Eretz Yisrael and you're living in Golus and there's no Gilui Elokus, you have to do the mitzvahs b'peil mamish. That's the second parsha of Kiddush. So the question becomes, how do we reconcile that the first parsha of Kiddush is in of Chesed and it's connected to Mab, which is Gevura, and the second parsha of Kiddush is in from Gevura and it's connected to Ab, which is Chesed? Or Kamavu, and we say that a parsha is like we know. There's four parshas: Kadesh, Hoy Kiviyacha, Shema, and V'Hoyim Shamaya, and these four parshas represent Chochma, Bina, Chesed, and Gevura. Kadesh is Chochma, and so on. So accordingly, Shema is Chesed, and V'Hoyim Shamaya is Gevura. Chesed is the opposite of Mab, and Gevura is the opposite of Ab. So in each case, you have a dichotomy. In each case, you have a paradox. In each case, you have a duality. In each case, you have a contradiction. Chesed is, the first parsha of Krishma is Ava and Chesed, and it's Mab. The second parsha of Krishma is Yid and Gevura, and it's Ab. Achain, in the Teretz is the Isa B'Zeir, it's already written in Zeir. Ala Eid, it's about the lights of Eidin Sof that come down into the vessels of Eidin Sof, and again, as we're learning it in this Maamar, the Pnimius that comes down into the Chitzenius, the Achalifu, the Chtayim. It is the notion of replacing places, changing places. V'achlilu smala b'yamin, including the left or the right. Now notice, Achalilu was the word Eskalilus. Hiskalos nachlif v'dachtai, as I taught it to you, are very different concepts. Because Hiskalos has to do with Kalim, and Nachlif v'dachtai has to do with Oir, and Tak and Tafresh Mem Gimel, when the Rebbe Rashab is struggling with this, he tries to explain Nachlif v'dachtai based on the theory of Hiskalos, and he rejects it. So, Pshat and Zoyer has to be said by a very, very big person. But Achlifu D'chtayu and Achlilu are not exactly the same thing. Achlilu D'chtayu means Oira Chesed B'Kli Gevura. The first parsha of Krishma is Eira Gevura B'Kli Chesed. The second parsha of Krishma is Eira Chesed B'Kli Gevura. V'abi, who the meaning is as follows: Shenis Chalfu Ha'eres B'B'chines Kleim. Each light was put into the alternative vessel. She'eira Chesed, the light of Chesed. Whatever Chesed is, She'eira B'Kli Gevura, rest in the vessel of Gevura. This is the second parsha of Krishma. And the light of Gevura rests in the Keli of Chesed. This is the first parsha of Krishma. So just like in Kabbalah you have the basic content of Achlifu D'chtayu, v'achinami bebeis Parshas Elu, when we read Krishma, that's how we understand it. Parsha Rishena is bebchinas Chesed, bebchinas Kelim. The vessel of the first parsha of Krishma is Chesed. V'yahavta b'chinas Kli Chesed. And again, the way I'm seeing it, this is the Pnimius God. V'shem Mab begevura. And the name Mab, which is Gevura, is Eir HaGevura Sheira B'Kli HaChesed. The light of Gevura, the rests on a foundation, on the vessel of Chesed. And again, if I'm not incorrect, in this case, the Keli is the Pnimius. The essence of the first Parsha Krishma is the Keli, which is Chesed. And the expression of that is in Gevura, and that's called Eir. Or Parsha Shni is the other way around. Shem Ab. The Eibishter's name Ab, which is Eir HaChesed, is B'Kli HaGevura, the vessel, the foundation of the second Parsha of Krishma is Gevura, but the light which radiates from it is a Chesed. And of course there's a very big difference between the Chesed in the second Parsha Krishma and the Chesed in the first Parsha Krishma. Okay? And we'll see this in Mitzvah Hashem in the subsequent classes. But let's go on. To explain all of this, we must first explain Yechudi Love Yechudi Tato, the idea which have in the Shari Yichud Emunah and the Akdama. And then of course later on is developed in the Shari Yichud Emunah itself. I think it's particularly in Pedic Vav. What's the idea of Yechudi Lord Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad and Bar Hashem Kfed Mechus L'Yelim Void is Yechudi Tato. Of course, the way the question is asked, and I recall having this conversation with you in other Maamar, that if Yechudi Allah is true, Yechudi Tato is a lie. And if Yechudi Tato is true, there's no Yechudi Allah. And of course the answer is, Kikel Deis Havaya, even though there's only one truth, but the way the Eibishter reveals himself through Shem Havaya, there's a Yechudi Allah and Yechudi Tato. And Shema Yisrael is the Yechudi Allah, and Bar Hashem Kfed Mechus L'Yelim Void is the Yechudi Tato. And most of what he's going to explain is Yechudi Allah. Yechudi Tato is going to be explained, mamish, in one line, in a few lines. 131. Mamish, a few shuras he's going to explain Yechudi Tato. He explains primarily Yechudi Allah. There's the words Havaya Elokeinu. Now notice, when the Rebbe says the words Havaya Elokeinu, you should immediately jump up and ask a question. What happened to Shema Yisrael? He skips 2 words. There's a very important reason why he's skipping 2 words, Shema Yisrael. Because Shema Yisrael is going to be the Keli. I'm sorry, the Shema Yisrael is going to be the Oir. And the Havaya Elokeinu is going to be the Keli. Shebe Pasuk Rishon the Kriya Shema, the first Pasuk of Krishma. So he leaves Shema Yisrael for later. He's going to go back to Shema Yisrael and explain the meditation of Shema Yisrael. And he's going to explain how the meditation of Shema Yisrael sets up the Gili of Havaya Elokeinu. Shezehu Inyan Hamshochas Ha'ir. These 2 words, Hashem and Elokeinu, represent that they're bringing Oir down Bechachmo Bina Datzilus into the 2 spheres, the 2 medias of Chachmo Bina Vatzilus, which is called Yichud Avah, the Yichud of Chachmo and Bina. Because the way the Eibishter created everything is Ein Seif, and Ein Seif is completely above any form and a limitation and a definition. And in the words Havaya Elokeinu, we're drawing forward the Ein Seif, and so to speak, grounding them, revealing them, bringing down into the vessels of Chochmah is Havaya and Bina is Elokeinu, as you'll see in Mitzvah Hashem also in a later shir. Upirosh, the idea is the idea of bringing down Ein Sof into Chochmah and Bina, which is called Havaya Elokeinu, can be explained by study the concept of Ishtalshlos, the chain reaction of worlds, and specifically the idea that the event of creation and the chain reaction of worlds involves Me'ayin Liyesh, a creation from a non-existential state into an independently existential state. That's the meaning of the word Ayin. And that's the meaning of the word Yesh, that it says in Chassidishe is Tamid, that it must be constant. Chinuch Katan is of course the Akdama to the Shari Yichud Emunah, but Yesh Me'ayin is really discussed in the Shari Yichud Emunah itself. It says the Rebbe on line 22, the phenomenon of the need for constant creation, that the Eibush has to create the world, again, is not only true of the physical world, the 7 heavens and the earth, of the physical universe, that that they must be renewed every hour, at every instant, from a non-existential state into a state of existence that's independent. And if for one instant there would be an interruption, a break in the procreation, the renewal of creation through the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they return to a state of nothingness, mamish. As if they had never been created in the first place. So the Alter Rebbe says we know that there's a concept of Yesh Meyayin, and that the concept of Yesh Meyayin is, as we call it classically, says the Rebbe, it's not only true in the physical world, it's true in the spiritual world. And even Atzilus. Even to create Bechinas Chochma Bina Atzilus. And Atzilus Bechlal is not considered Yesh Meyayin. Atzilus is considered Gilui HaHelim. But even the Gilui HaHelim of Chochma and Bina has to be Bechol Rega V'Rega. As the Pasuk says, in one aspect, in a certain aspect, even Atzilus, and even Chochma Atzilus is created Meyayin Liyesh, and therefore has to be renewed Bechol Rega V'Rega. So the idea that Hashem has to constantly be involved in His creation is not true only on the level of the lowest world, it's true also on the level of the very highest worlds. Once Chochmah comes forward from Ayin to Yesh, it comes down into Bina, like it says in the Pasuk, and Chochmah and Bina have to be renewed every single second. And this idea that you have to have renewal every second is that every instant the river is flowing from the source, which is Eden, to renew life. That Yesh in Lashon Tmidyas, it's not a historic event, that it yotza, that it did go out, but it's going on perpetually. That Amshach HaMeyayin Yesh is every single instant trained in Lamas Pashin, like it says in Kabbalah, that Chochmah Bina are always one, and they're constantly being renewed. And this idea that creation has to be renewed all the time, not only physical creation, but also spiritual creation, and not only spiritual creation, but godly creation, all the way till Chochmah Bina. That's the pshat in the pasuk Hashabara Lakim Lasis. The Pirash Hashabara is Yesh Meyayin Ruchni, Bechinas da Chochmah Meyayin Timatzi. The two words Hashabara talk about the emergence of Yesh Meyayin on the spiritual level. Now, of course, the Ramban brings that the word Bara, Breishis Bara, Ein Lecha Lashon Bria Yesh Meyayin Gadol Mizeh. But we associate that word Bara and that Ramban expression of Ein Lecha Yesh Meyayin Gadol Mizeh to Bria. He is using the word Bara as an allusion to Atzilus, the Chochmah Bina of Atzilus. Eventually had the Madrega of Asiyah, which goes on the Gashmi, the Kabul Bechinas Me'ayin Liyesh Gashmi. So we've set up our Maamar. I gave you a very lengthy introduction. And the introduction is that what we're ultimately going to explain, that the first Parsha of Krishma is describing a Yiddishkeit, where the most important thing is Ruchnius and Elokus. And it's Eira Gavura Bekliya Chesed. And in this case, Kliya Chesed, this is the Pnimius. And the second Parsha of Krishma is describing, so to speak, the second base of Mikdash and Zman HaGolus, which is Oir HaChesed Bekli HaGavura. And again, the Gavura is the Ikir, and the Chesed, which comes from it, is secondary. And then we learned some of the Kashas in the Maamar. In Mitzvah Hashem, next week we're going to learn Shema Yisrael, actually. And in the class after next, if things go as planned, we're going to do the Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. The Havaya Elokeinu we started now is not going to be next week. It's going to be in 2 weeks from now. Next week we're going to do the Shema Yisrael, which sets up the Havaya Elokeinu Havaya Echad. And of course the last class is going to be about the second Parsha of Krishma.